Hello again, honeys. It is your host, Celia, once again, back with the buzz for this week. And boy, do I have some good ones for you today. From follow-ups to major sales, announcements, discoveries, and more, I've got you covered, so let's go ahead and dive in. Beginning with new information on old stories, old headlines, we learned that the UK Parliament will debate whether or not to ban sponsorship and advertising by fossil fuel companies. Arts News writes that a petition calling to ban deals like the £50 million or $63.3 million partnership between energy giant BP and the British Museum collected more than 1,000 signatures, meaning those MPs are now legally obligated to debate this topic in Parliament. Arts News writes, quote, "Those campaigning for the change argue that the government should prohibit the promotion of coal, oil, and gas companies due to their role in exacerbating climate change," end quote, and point out that the British government has bowed to similar pressures before, for example, when the Labour government banned tobacco advertising in 2003. For its part, the government has stated it is, quote, "committed to reducing emissions from high-carbon products," end quote, but has, quote, "no plans to restrict fossil fuel advertising," end quote. It also clarified that the final decision regarding the restriction of advertising would fall on the Independent Committees of Advertising Practice and Advertising Standards Authority. The debate was live-streamed on Parliament's website at 4:30 p.m. UK time, but as of this recording, it is unclear what the results of that debate were. At the core of this debate, honeys, is the issue of greenwashing. As Francis Morris, the director of the Tate Modern between 2016 and 2023, told the Arts newspaper, quote, "While many museums, cultural institutions, and artists are taking significant measures to combat the escalating climate and nature crisis, it is deeply frustrating that a few high-profile institutions demonstrate irresponsible leadership and continue to endorse greenwashing corporate partnership deals with major planetary polluters," end quote. However, legislation like this, in her opinion, would force these institutions to refocus on their public responsibilities and on rebuilding public trust. Furthermore, any such ban might make the recent trend of distancing from fossil fuel companies by the National Portrait Gallery of London, the Tate Galleries, and the Royal Opera House, all of whom ended their sponsorship deals with BP in recent years, a legal necessity instead of just a socially savvy move. We also learned that the Musée Guimet, a Paris museum known for its rich collection of Asian art, is facing a lawsuit over attempts to, quote, "erase the existence of Tibet," end quote. The French publication Agence France Presse first reported the news of the complaint last week. The suit itself was filed by what the press agency identified as four unnamed, quote-unquote, pro-Tibetan groups. It also quoted their lawyers as saying it was, quote, "hard not to see a political undertone and a deliberate choice by Guimet to align itself with Chinese lobbying efforts," end quote, to reclassify Tibet as one of its autonomous regions. For its part, the museum said that using the phrase Himalayan world in reference to a gallery devoted to art from Nepal and Tibet was an effort to, quote, "highlight the richness of cultural interactions across this vast and complex region," end quote, not an attempt to erase or deny Tibetan identity. We included this update, honeys, because, as we covered at the time last year, more than 140 organizations signed an open letter that said the Musée Guimet, quote, "risked endorsing China's colonization of Tibet and the systematic erasure of its culture and heritage," end quote, with its current handling of the situation. Unfortunately, by doing nothing, it appears they have dug the hole deeper. Also last week, on Thursday, the first ever Hermes Birkin bag sold for a record-breaking $8.2 million at Sotheby's Paris to an anonymous Japanese buyer, while Bonhams announced an auction of Downton Abbey costumes and props ahead of the final film release. The sale will run online from August 18th through September 16th alongside a free, open-to-the-public exhibition at Bonhams' New Bond Street, London. The timing of the auction coincides with the release of Downton Abbey, the grand finale. Our sources say that highlights of the sale include the frill-free 1920s wedding dress that Michelle Dockery wore as Lady Mary, as well as harem pants worn by Jessica Brown Finley, donned as Lady Sybil, and one of Dame Maggie Smith's dresses in light pink and dark gray, while the prices themselves are quite varied. Best of luck to our bidders. In other news, the Bronx Museum has named Shamim M. Momim as its next director. She will step into the role in early September amid a planned $42.9 million transformation of the museum's South Wing set to wrap up next fall. Momim was most recently director of curatorial affairs at the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, but also served at the Whitney and co-founded the nonprofit Los Angeles Nomadic Division in 2008. We also got wind of the Getty Villas reopening 6 months after the devastating Palisades fire. The iconic LA venue started welcoming visitors back on June 27th with a limited schedule, but also a new exhibition featuring artworks and artifacts from ancient Greece. According to the museum, some of these 230-plus objects dated to the Bronze Age have never been shown outside Europe before. Our sources for the day also report that the Getty did not erase all traces of the fire, but rather left some burned tree stumps and other remnants to acknowledge the local reality. We also learned Crystal Bridges and Art Bridges acquired 90 works of contemporary native art. The art in question comes from the St. Louis-based John and Susan Horseman collection, itself focused on supporting Indigenous and African American artists. The very long list includes works by Kent Monkman, Tyrell Tapaha, George Morrison, Johnny Quick-to-See Smith, Rick Bartow, Kay Walkingstick, James Lavardor, Emmy Whitehorse, T.C. Cannon, and more. The two organizations will divide the works quite unevenly. 9 will go to Crystal Bridges, and the other 81 will be added to the collection of Art Bridges, which funds exhibitions across the U.S. dedicated to American art. The why we care here? Well, as our sources put it, quote, acquisitions of Indigenous art of this scale are still rare at U.S. museums, end quote. In fact, it's part of an overall collecting strategy by Crystal Bridges to expand its holdings in both Native art and American art because, as our sources report, quote, though the museum's focus is on American art, its holdings of Native art have only numbered around 120 works, or about 3% of its total collection, end quote. But with these 81 works becoming part of Art Bridges collections, they are also becoming available for loan to over 250 partner organizations, primarily regional museums. And that context allows for more frequent, deeper, and wider interpretation and reach with these artworks. Quote, John Horseman said he was motivated to give his works to Crystal Bridges and Art Bridges with the hope that contemporary Native art will be placed alongside the work of non-Native artists. Inner quotes, there'll be a breath of fresh air and awareness, end all quotes. We also learned that the United Arab Emirates will open a massive new museum on Abu Dhabi's Saadiyat Island in December. It will be named for the first president of the 7 Emirates of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, and will not only focus on his biography and leadership, but also, says its director Peter McGee to the art newspaper, quote, the historical trajectory of the country from the earliest times through to the more recent past, end quote. Featuring objects from across the centuries of the UAE region, the design of it will be modeled after a falcon's wing in flight, as falconry is an integral part of Emirati culture. The headline caught our attention because this new museum will be joining other major cultural institutions already on the island, including the Louvre Abu Dhabi, Team Lam Phenomena Abu Dhabi, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, and the upcoming Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi when it opens. So it's notable to have this huge influx of arts and culture institutions on the island, and all of them together will likely support Abu Dhabi's plans to draw almost 40 million tourists each year by 2030. So in this context, we are seeing the arts and humanities become an economic engine for the UAE. But the week was not without its perils and pitfalls. We also learned that Spain's Museum of Censored Art has shuttered indefinitely after labor protests. The Museo de l'Art Prohibit in Barcelona was the world's first museum dedicated to censored art. It was described by the Times in London as, quote, the most offensive museum in the world, end quote. It had a collection of 200-plus objects and showcased banned works by artists including Ai Weiwei, David Wojnarowicz, and Abel Azcona. Its closure on June 27th came less than 2 years after its October 2023 launch following ongoing disruption from striking workers of the Solidarity and Unity of Workers Union, who'd been picketing the institution because of worker claims of, quote, precarious working conditions, end quote, such as an alleged lack of, quote, temperature control, seasonally appropriate work attire, and furniture for sitting during long work shifts, end quote. The museum provided its own defense, saying it has passed 3 labor inspections, attended 2 mediation sessions with unionized workers, and cited, quote, a favorable court ruling, end quote, that it has not violated workers' rights to strike. As you can imagine, our main concern here is the loss of a censorship-free zone and the loss of access to art. Our sources also report that the Solidarity and Unity of Workers Union has led dozens of labor protests at cultural institutions across Spain, including the Museo Reina Sofia, Museo del Prado, and Museo Picasso Barcelona, Barcelona in the last couple of decades. While this is very good for labor rights, it's unfortunate that the closure of the museum was the result here. However, the art newspaper reported on Thursday that self-titled art detective Arthur Brand had recovered a trove of documents stolen from the Dutch National Archive. The 25 documents, stolen in 2015, are listed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register and relate to the Dutch East India Company. Among other things, they include a report of the company's first meeting in 1602. So what's the story here? A person clearing out an ill relative's attic found the box containing them and showed it to a former college history professor who urged that person to contact Brand, who was already known in the field for a series of high-profile recoveries, such as paintings by Van Gogh, Picasso, and others in 2023. But here's the twist, honeys. Quote, in a statement to the NL Times, the institution said that it knew some of the documents were missing, but confirmed that it was unaware they'd been stolen, end quote. A spokesperson for the archive said, quote, we manage more than 145 kilometers of archives, over 15 million photos, and 300,000 maps and drawings. With such numbers, it is impossible to have a complete inventory of all the documents, end quote. And while I disagree in theory, that does tend to be my experience in practice. Still, quite the recovery here. But last week also saw Homeland Security target Chicago's National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture. According to the Chicago Sun-Times, at least 15 DHS vehicles arrived in the museum's parking lot Tuesday of last week, and Veronica Ocasio, the museum's director of education and programming, said they stayed for almost 2 hours. One agent, who didn't identify himself as an agent, got permission to use the bathroom, and another one followed him in, but instead both looked around inside and ignored staff requests to leave while doing so. They, quote, also reportedly refused to present a warrant or identification, end quote, and delayed identifying the agency they were with. Said Billy Ocasio, the museum's president and CEO, to Hyperallergic, quote, people were frightened, they didn't know how to respond and were intimidated, end quote. While Veronica Ocasio said in a Wednesday news briefing, quote, we as a staff, as the National Puerto Rican Museum, will not allow this bullying and intimidation to happen here, end quote. Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin claimed in statements to the press that there was no targeting, that the museum's version of events was, quote, false, end quote, and that these were agents of Chicago's Financial Crimes Task Force that were holding a quick briefing in the museum's parking lot before taking planned action in a narcotics investigation. But our sources also report that Ocasio said that the staff heard the agents discussing the museum's upcoming festivals, including the Barrio Arts Fest this weekend, while in said parking lot. In response, says Hyperallergic, the museum is, quote, planning to have on-site private security, legal observers, and attorneys trained in immigration law, end quote, at its Barrio Fest, and will take similar measures for fests scheduled through the end of August. Meanwhile, the Centre Pompidou's cancellation of a Caribbean art show raised questions in France. The show, titled Van Leve, or the Creole version of the French phrase Le vent se leve, meaning the wind rises, it was to be organized by Guadeloupean curator Claire Tancons, who has previously worked on editions of the Sharjah Biennial and Prospect New Orleans, and it would have opened in October of 2026. According to French publication Le Monde, an email exchange between Tancons and Centre Pompidou Met's director Chiara Parisi over, quote, a particularly difficult budgetary context that is forcing us to reorganize the exhibitions and events initially planned in our program in a drastic manner, end quote, ended with the show's cancellation in late June. Meanwhile, Tancons told Le Monde that Parisi's claims of budgetary limitations were, quote unquote, unbelievable, and said that the exhibition had already received funding from organizations such as the Ford Foundation. A range of artists came together to issue a statement condemning the decision to pull the show and asking whether forms of bias played a role in the museum's decision-making process. Its signatories include Zeneb Sedira, who represented France at the 2022 Venice Biennale, and one of the artists set to be featured in Van Leve, Tabita Rezaire. Another concerning headline from last week, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Adam Ziegler was set to have his retrospective exhibit at the Buffalo Museum's closing celebrated via a free happy hour event called Drawing Support for Local Journalism. But on July 10th, Buffalo newspapers announced the event was canceled after increasing public backlash, including death threats towards the artist over a recent cartoon. The cartoon in question is titled Swept Away and depicts a man in a red MAGA hat nearly fully submerged in floodwaters holding up a sign reading help, while a speech bubble belonging to a seemingly submerged person behind him cites the Republican phrase, quote, government is the problem, not the solution, end quote. The Buffalo police have confirmed the department's threat management unit is investigating the situation. The cartoon was drawn in response to flood surges along the Guadalupe River in Texas, which have have killed 120 people, according to Kerr County officials, while another 161 remain missing. Our sources for the day write, quote, "The catastrophe has been scrutinized for inadequate flash flood warnings from the National Weather Service amid Donald Trump's staffing cuts to the government agency," end quote, while FEMA's fate and thus future role here is still in question. The Buffalo Museum said the event was also supposed to serve as the launch for the Protect Local Journalism community campaign. The decision to cancel it, therefore, quote, "comes in a moment of tension that underscores rather than undermines the very purpose of this exhibition," end quote, and that they will reschedule. Also last week, under the argument that a new exhibition examining the site's connections to slavery, segregation, and white supremacy violates state law, Georgia's division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans Heritage Group has filed a lawsuit against Georgia Stone Mountain Park. According to the Associated Press, the decision by the Parks Memorial Association, quote, "to relocate Confederate flags and build what it calls a truth-telling show is at odds with the park's original mandate to honor the Confederacy," end quote, and which is, in fact, Georgia law. Stone Mountain itself is believed to be the largest Confederate monument in the country and is a bas-relief carving featuring notable figures like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson on horseback. Debates are still ongoing about whether it honors Southern history or promotes the Lost Cause mythology, aka the framing of the Confederacy's secession as a fight for states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery. The park's board voted in 2021 to make limited changes such as commissioning an exhibition that would contextualize the site's KKK-linked history, including an infamous cross burning atop the mountain in the year that the work began on the mountain, 1915, and to feature stories of a Black community that lived near the base of it after the Civil War as a means of broadening the local narrative. The Georgia legislature approved an $11 million fund allocation in 2023 for this exhibit and renovations of Memorial Hall. While a spokesperson for the Sons of Confederate Veterans said, quote, "when they come after the history and attempt to change everything to the present political structure, that's against the law," end quote, "this is why they might actually not like that." Art News reports, quote, "the project would examine how the trauma of war and Reconstruction created fertile ground for the Lost Cause movement and how groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans help promote it through public monuments, education campaigns, and support for segregation laws," end quote. With that in mind, it does seem as though the Sons are more interested in preserving their reputation than telling the truth of history. Feel free to make your own conclusions there. Members of Penn Museum Workers United Local 397 at the Penn Museum unanimously voted to authorize a strike last week after their contract expired at the end of June in order to obtain higher wages from the largest private employer in the city, the University of Pennsylvania. The union represents around 50 staffers across departments like visitor services, public programming, collections management, conservation, and the work stoppage has not been called yet, but the executive board of the union is ready to follow through on it if negotiations fail or do not improve. Right, our sources, quote, "the museum union has been in negotiations with the university for weeks, demanding a wage increase that not only keeps pace with the rising cost of living, but also addresses alleged pay inequities," end quote. The workers plan to stage an informational picket outside the museum's Garden Jams event to amplify their calls for increased salaries on July 9th, but Penn officials and spokespeople have yet to comment. And finally, in no particular order, some notable discoveries and announcements from the last week. The ancient Mayan tomb of Caracol's founding king was unearthed in Belize. The discovery of the 1600-year-old tomb was made by researchers from the University of Houston in the city's northeast Acropolis, a ceremonial and residential complex just beyond the urban core. It belonged to the founding ruler of Caracol, one of the most powerful Maya cities of the Classic period, which housed more than 100,000 people and covered 68 square miles at its peak. Tekab Chak, whose name translates to tree branch rain god, assumed the throne in 331 CE, and we found this headline intriguing because it marks the first time a clearly identified royal tomb has been found at the site in over 4 decades of excavation. It is also one of 3 recently unearthed in the area, which appear to belong to native Maya royalty. Another bit of exciting news, a Night at the Museum reboot is in the works. Literally all we know so far is that it's happening at 20th Century Studios. 21 Laps Entertainment has hired Tripper Clancy to pen the script, and that all new characters will be the stars of this yet unknown plot. We also learned of a new art fair for women-led galleries in London. Launched by gallery owner India Rose James, the new event, Echo Soho, will debut on October 16th at Artists House townhouse on Manette Street. It will feature 12 exhibitors across 2 floors of the Georgian townhouse. What will be special about this event is that it aims to have a more accessible, complementary platform for mid-size and emerging galleries than the concurrently running Frieze London event. It is taking on a share of the financial burden for the participants and has focused its exhibitor list on women-led galleries like participants Pipeline, Gillian Jason Gallery, and Awita. Another notable headline, the Bayeux Tapestry will return to the UK for the first time in 900 years. The tapestry is an iconic 230-foot-long embroidered cloth that depicts the Norman invasion of 1066 and is prized as one of the great works of the Romanesque style. The tapestry features 58 scenes, 626 characters, and 202 horses. It was the inspiration for narrative techniques and other artistic interpretations for countless works after. It will be loaned to the British Museum next year as the result of an agreement between British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron in exchange for the loan of objects from the Sutton Hoo ship burial and the 12th century Lewis chess pieces. What was fascinating to us about this story is that the tapestry's first visit to the UK in such a very long time is itself a multi-year work in progress. That's because Macron first announced plans for a 2022 loan of the tapestry back in 2018 in a gesture that was intended to symbolize continued connections between the UK and France post-Brexit. But at that point, conservators found it was too fragile to travel, so the delay was made to stabilize it. Furthermore, it could show signs of a brighter exhibiting loaning future. As Andrew Saluti, an associate professor of museum studies at Syracuse University, told the New York Times, quote, "The fact this loan has actually been brokered is just a monumental kind of collaborative effort in terms of sharing this cross-cultural legacy. The tides could be shifting," end quote, for the British Museum, which, as Art Firm puts it, quote, "has historically resisted repatriating antiquities residing in its own collection," end quote. And there you have it, honeys, your buzz for the week. Hope you found a couple interesting things to pay attention to and or follow up with on your own here. I will be taking next week off. I have decided it is time for me to actually enjoy this summer and take a little vacation, so you will not be getting a Beesness, but expect the full-length episode Past Exposures to drop Thursday of this week instead. Make sure that even as you are having fun in the sun, you are continuing to hydrate and use sunscreen and take care of yourselves. And until next time, talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.